Okay, I think we're right on time. Morena, everyone. Welcome here today. Let us start with karakia. Hei karakia tīmataka. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. Ihi aki ana te atakura, hei tiho, hei huka, hei hohu. Tu tuturu o whiti ka whakamoa, kia tina, haumie, huie, tai kie. Tēnā koutou katoa, no ingari, no kotiana, I tipu aki a hau, I raro, I te tāwharo, o nai pai moka o paparoa, I taha o te awa o otatutu, ko te Murphin te whānau, kei otipoti toku kaiakim naene, o Bridget Murphin Beach, toku ingoa, no rera, tēnā koutou, katoa. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to Otago, Whakaihu Waka, the University of Otago, on behalf of our Critical Disability Studies Network. I acknowledge mana whenua and those who have gone before us, and I acknowledge and welcome everyone who has joined us here today in person and online. At the end of a year that I'm sure has felt long and challenging for us all, it is energising to bring this Networking November series to life. It is something that we have thought about and planned for a long time. And over the course of this month, we are gathering in our hundreds, actually, to share in a wide range of research in the critical disability studies area. We are excited that so many people have been interested in the skilled and diverse range of researchers that we have been able to draw together for the series from our shores and from overseas. And we really hope you will reach out to the presenters and to each other to establish connections and share research questions and interests, as connection and collegiality, whakawhanaunataka, are the goals of our network. Before I introduce the speakers for today, I would like to thank everyone in advance for your patience if we have any accessibility issues related to running the series as a hybrid event. We know the sound quality and the positioning of our fantastic interpreters meant that things were not perfect for everyone online last week, and we're doing our best to continue to improve in this regard, but please tell us if there are any major problems. So let's get started. I'm honoured to have the job of chairing our session for today. Both of our speakers have worked inclusively alongside people with a learning disability throughout their respective careers. Both have worked to transform systems, policies and practices that impact the lives of disabled people, again with a particular focus on equity for people with a learning disability. Both have spent many decades involved in research, advocacy and activism designed to promote sexual and relationship rights and eliminate abuse and violence in the lives of people with a learning disability. And over recent years, we're fortunate that these shared priorities have brought them together to re-examine and reimagine the ecological model of disability, abuse and violence. And as I've said, we have the good fortune to be able to share in their expertise today. Over the next 2 hours, we will learn from Nancy and Patsie separately and together in what we know will be a challenging and thought-provoking session. We will cover the issues of protection, the notion of inherent vulnerability, and unpack a flipped model, ecological model of disability, violence and abuse. But before I introduce the way our session today will run and introduce Nancy particularly, as the first of the duo to present, I just want to draw your attention to our trigger warning, our content warning. The session is focused on abuse and violence and associated issues, and we acknowledge this is a very important, difficult topic, but one that's important to confront. Not talking about abuse and violence doesn't make it go away. In our Royal Commission of Inquiry, we'll have the apology next week. The Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care has shown us that. However, we encourage anyone attending today, online or in person, to take care. Feel free to come and go as you need to. And if you need support after the session, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. So on that note, let's get started. And I'm really excited to welcome Professor Nancy Fitzsimons. Nancy is a professor and former director of the Master of Social Work program at Minnesota State University, Makato. Her research is focused on translating research evidence, particularly in the area of disability, sexual and other forms of violence, so that it's useful, it informs policy and practice at both the social service and the governmental levels. And we have been really fortunate to meet Nancy recently through our associations with Patsie, and Nancy and I had the great good fortune to spend a little bit of time together at the International Congress on Intellectual Disability Research in Chicago a couple of months ago. So thank you for coming, Nancy. It's a long way. It's been a big week for you. So welcome to the session.
Kia ora. Thank you for this opportunity to be with all of you today here in the room and those of you who are out wherever you may be watching this presentation. I'm really honored to be here with all of you. My presentation is going to be talking about the illusion of protection. And I looked up the word illusion. I like looking up words, something that deceives or misleads. This work is, and this presentation certainly is based on research that I've been doing for a number of years that's forming a book that really is to just look at our practices starting in the late 1960s, specifically in the United States of America, since we began closing large state institutions, in part as a result of seeing the horrific abuses that were going on in these facilities, and just trying to understand the evolution of this protectionist approach and what it is, and as I say, the illusion of it. It's also a part of some larger thinking about illusion, the illusion of safety, which is impossible, which is why I think we need to think and act in terms of safer, creating safer. The illusion of community in the way in which we practice community with people with intellectual disabilities, which is the term we use in the United States. And I know other parts of the world use learning disability, and maybe there's other terminology. The illusion of the way we practice person-centeredness in the United States that has been co-opted by disability systems and services in ways that is not person-centered. The illusion of quality in our quality assurance schemes that really do not, in my estimation, promote quality. So this is a piece of a larger body of work that I've been looking at. So just a little, because I realize you may not know at all where I'm from, and I thought I should add the slide. So although some of you may have followed the election, so you know something. So I hail from the blue state on the center of the map there. That's Minnesota, so that's just right below in terms of Canada is above. Born and raised in St. Paul, Minnesota, where that little star is, that's our capital city. It's part of the Twin Cities. If you ever come, Minneapolis and St. Paul, people are much more familiar with Minneapolis, but I'm born and raised in St. Paul. My practice work, I'm a social worker, bachelor's, master's, and PhD. I've been a social worker for my entire life. I consider myself what's called a macro social worker. Policy, community engagement kinds of work is the work that I've been done. And when I moved to Illinois, which is the orange state is Wisconsin, and below that in that, is it like a purpley color? That's Illinois. So I moved to Chicago area and I practiced for about 15 years there, doing lots of work in lots of different spaces connected to people with intellectual disabilities and their families. And then I came back home to Minnesota. And so on the other side of the screen is a map. If you look at the bottom there where those are the two counties. So that is where I hail from now, Mankato or Makato. And so I work in Makato, which is in the Blue Earth County, the square county, and I live in North Makato, which is in sort of that river, upside down triangle, I guess, county. The thing I do want to acknowledge for you all to understand is that Minnesota is the land of the Anishinaabe people, both the Chippewa Band and the Ojibwe Band, and that they inhabited the middle northern part of the state. The part that I live in is the Dakota people's land. the Sioux, Dakota Sioux, and they inhabited the lower portion of Minnesota. I should also say the Mississippi, the mighty Mississippi, starts in Minnesota. Some of you may be familiar with the river in Isanti. And when I was a little girl, and this didn't cost any money, so we did things that didn't cost money. We would drive up to Isanti, and you would get to walk and dip your toes where the river begins. And it flows all the way south, and I can't give you the exact trajectory, but it ends in Louisiana, which is that very bottom purple state next to the big yellow state, which is Texas, and enters into the Gulf of Mexico. And the last thing I'll just say about where I'm from is the river that runs in my area, the Minnesota River, actually it flows north to south, which is, south to north, which is very unusual, and I can't explain it. I just know it does it. So that's where I'm from. So what's the aim of my presentation? Obviously, I don't have a lot of time, so what I think I'm going to do is take you a little bit on highlighting some of the journey of my own journey of a sort of unpacking, thinking about this protection approach and response. So it's to support critical questioning of how society, through public policy and the use of public dollars, invests in approaches that fail to prevent. Prevent means to stop something from happening, and minimally protects against interpersonal violence, which is the term Patsie and I are using to the right array of abuses and violence in the lives of people with intellectual disabilities that can contribute to unsafer, not sure if that's a word, but that contribute to unsafer in their lives. So this slide here really is the nuts and bolts of thinking about what I think of as our protection approach. And again, it's thinking about the evolution of our protection approach, beginning in the 1960s as we start to deinstitutionalize. And what did we do? What were the approaches we put in place in response to the horrific abuses in these institutions? And I put them into three pockets that also intersect. They don't operate independent of one another. Restrictive practices, the gatekeeping that goes on, restricting access for people, to places, to information, to opportunities, with guardianship being one of those most restrictive practices, in particular in the ways that guardianship is often practiced. And then the many restrictive practices that are rooted in behaviorism, which is rooted in compliance-based training. And compliance-based training makes people easy targets and much more vulnerable, which Patsie will be talking more about, to interpersonal violence. So that's sort of your one aspect of this. The other is all of our external protection approaches, which includes guardianship. And in the United States, it is not uncommon for young people moving into their young adult years to automatically go from being a minor under the legal responsibility of their parents to guardianship. It's not uncommon to get a letter from your special education program telling you, the parent, you should go and get guardianship of your child before they turn 18. It's known as civil death. People write about that, but I also believe it's human development death. And what I mean by that is that you take somebody at the prime of developing into who they are and you thwart that development, right? We also do mandated reporting. I'll allude to that a little bit later about people who are mandated to report when they suspect or know. And this can happen unbeknownst to the person, they themselves, and reporting into this separate kind of a system that is independent certainly in the United States, in the adult protection world. It is independent of any other mechanism that crimes or other forms of abuse might be channeled through. Pre-employment and background checks and registries for people who may have a history of offending. We do vulnerable adult protection training, which is mostly in the United States. This is what maltreatment is. This is how you recognize it. This is how you report it. There is nothing preventative about what we do. And then we do risk assessments and do abuse prevention plans. I'll talk a little bit about that. And they are not preventing. And they are, minimally protecting. And then we have our special response systems that we've created. And in the United States, we have a vulnerable adult reporting and investigation system. And then we have a licensing investigation sort of system. And again, this is separate systems that these reports will funnel through. It is most common that, especially in a license setting, that when a finding of substantiated or maybe inconclusive is made, that the provider then needs to put together a plan of correction, right? So they do an internal investigation, their own. They may do and there's an external investigation, and most often the findings of these investigations are inconclusive, occasionally substantiated. And these are plans of correction that are paper compliance that most often consist of, and I have to tell you, I read hundreds of these, that most often consist of retrain, get rid of the bad apple. It's pretty much sort of what we do, and it's paper compliance, and it really doesn't change the circumstances of people's lives. So that in a nutshell, I think, is our protectionist approach. And it shouldn't be surprising why that isn't working. So I'm going to highlight some things here. Like I said, I like history. I think it's important to recognize that some of what Patsie and I do is grounded in work that's been done for a long time. This is not new, right? The prison of protection comes from the work of Dave Hinsberger. I believe he's been down here to do work here at the Beasley Center, the Donald Beasley Center. So the prison of protection is basically this person here inherently vulnerable, and we're going to protect them, right? We're going to wrap them in this bubble. And I'll quickly just say that this was an important story for me. David Hinsberg tells the story of the sexual assault of Annette by her brother-in-law in her own home. After the rape, Annette's life changed. Her parents were distraught and angry decisions were made. Annette was no longer seen as a competent young woman. She became a victim. She became vulnerable. And they decided she could no longer ride the transit, the bus. She could no longer go to work in the community. She couldn't walk through her neighborhood. She was to be kept at home where she could be watched at all times. She was to be protected. And Dave goes on to write, he's one of my heroes. So that's why, he says, it was difficult talking with Annette's family. They were firm. She was to be kept safe at all costs, even if the cost was personal liberty, even if the cost was giving her a life of great despair, with no joy, with no opportunity, right? The trying to point out to them that their decision did not make sense was impossible. Finally, it had to be said. Annette was not raped on the transit. Annette was not raped at the workshop. Annette was not raped in her neighborhood. Annette was not raped while cleaning houses. That was her job. Annette was raped in her own home, where she is now a prisoner, right? That's his story, right? The prisoner of protection. That's our restrictive protectionist model, right? And he writes about, and we think about the dehumanizing indignity of safety, which is why I talk about how do we create safer in the lives of people with intellectual disabilities, but really in all of our lives. I'm highlighting some things because I know that sometimes as you think about your own understanding of this issue and the work that's done here, I'm also mindful that sometimes we go to other places to think about how do we adapt what they do and bring it back, and you should do your homework. Do your research, people, right? So this is an example of a protection response of failed systems. And then the answer somehow, once these men were rescued after 35 years, was that they should have had a guardian. So this is a group of men in the state of Texas that this was an opportunity for their deinstitutionalization. So they were moved up to a small town in Iowa to work at a turkey processing plant. Not a pleasant type of work to do. And they lived in what was called the bunkhouse. And in the beginning, the community members came in and saw these and were a part of their lives. Over time, horrific abuses happened, and they became increasingly isolated within the turkey processing plant and within their home. Although they did go to church on Sundays. And what's most troubling about our in the community and about the community members' responses, they always referred to them as boys. They were grown men who had aged extensively. But while the horrific abuses were happening to these men, nobody noticed, despite the fact that they were in church with them every week, right? What does that say, right? The initial reporting of this was not taken seriously, and that was in 1979. And it wasn't until 2009, right? There were efforts and efforts made, and the system did not go in and do their job. And it wasn't until 2009, based on the tenacity of a sister who lived at another part of the country, who found out that her brother, after all this work in the turkey processing plant, had like $85 to his name, right? So they were profiting off of it. And they came and got the men, created wonderful new lives for these men. But one of their answers was they needed a guardian, right? Absolutely absurd. This is an example of an individual abuse prevention plan, and I don't have time to walk through all the layers of it, but it actually takes what the provider is asked to do in terms to assess somebody's susceptibility to sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, financial exploitation, as well as self-abuse and physically aggressing against others. And it's one of those things where when you start to dissect what people are asked to do, it's utterly and completely ridiculous, because let's look at one of them under the physical abuse, the inability to deal with verbally, physically aggressive persons. Why should anybody be able to right? This is an official government sanctioned protocol for doing individual abuse prevention plans. The inability to be assertive, right? Which is not humanly possible because we all assert in one way or right. So I present this though as this illusion of protection. We invest all of this money in creating these plans. And there's nothing in the plan that actually is typically written to address any of these, what they think are people's susceptibilities or vulnerabilities. You have to really look carefully about what we are asking people to do. And this is an entire system of an illusion of protection that we've invested in, and they're ridiculous. So let's give you an example. I read these reports because you can get them online, and I just read them, right, in my home state. And so this is an example of one. It's from 2018, but it highlights a few things that are important. People in a group home, in a community, 4-person group home. 2 young women were sexually assaulted over 300 times. Okay. All these protection approaches are in place, right? And so the report says this, that the 2 individuals were partially verbal, limiting communication abilities. It says in their plans that they were not able to defend themselves. They were not able to report, right? And the facility ensured that staff persons intervened in sexually abusive situations and remained attentive for signs and symptoms of sexual abuse. Yet this happened 300 times. Like, this is accepted. This is accepted, right? Absurd, right? Also, what did they do to give people any ability to communicate, right? There are lots of ways to communicate something has happened, okay? So that's part of what their assessment was. As is common in these systems, the person who perpetrated the sexual assault, who is the responsible party, and the facility was deemed not responsible. And why? Because they had individual abuse prevention plans in place, at least on paper, right? They were trained on the facility's policies and procedures, right? And they knew how to report. Yet this happened over 300 times. Now, here's the irony of all of this. If the staff who eventually recognized something wasn't right, if they had followed the mandated reporting law, what they would have done was they would have reported this to their supervisor, who would have been responsible for reporting something. And maybe it would have been reported. I don't know. It's hard to say what would have happened. But that's not what they did. They showed up in the middle of the night during the 3rd shift. They looked in the window and they watched it happening. They picked up their phone, they dialed 911, which in the United States is your police response. The police responded, came, saw it in the act, went in and nabbed the perpetrator. if they had followed the mandated reporting requirements, right? They would have certainly have gone in, but they would have followed this reporting procedure, right? When they suspected this, if they suspect that, who knows how much longer this would have gone on. So what I say to you is we have to really question what is mandated reporting really doing or not doing, right? In this incidence. One would think that in my home state, if something like this happened 300 times, there would have been a major inquiry about what is going on. This is none whatsoever. This is my, I think my last example, again, critically questioning what is it that we're doing? Where am I at here? I'm good? Okay. Again, looking at systems, right? So this is, I hate to pick on Texas, but oh well, I pick on my own state, Texas. So this is in 2009, and it's about Fight Club at one of the state institutions. And what does that mean? That means that in the middle of the night, the staff would wake up and drag the individuals that lived in that home out of bed and make them fight like human cockfighting. It went on for a period of time. The only way it was, and the only way that it was discovered was that they had the audacity, one of them, to film it. What does that say about what you think and understand about, right? What you can get away with? They filmed it. They lost their phone. Somebody found the phone. They turned the phone into the police. The police opened the phone. They looked at, they find this video. This is how Fight Club was discovered. So how did the system respond? This is how the systems always respond. 11 overnight shift staff were terminated, right? All of the 13 Texas state schools, which are now called, they keep changing their name, by the way. They're now called state-supported living centers. Like that changed anything. Were retrained on how to recognize and report abuse. Increased supervision at night, installed surveillance cameras, enhanced requirements for background checks. This is our protectionist approach, right? They created a statewide hotline to report. Initially, it was only available Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., which is not when this was happening, by the way, right? And I want to just have to read what I wrote because I want us to think about this. Think about it. Staff had to be retrained, more intensely supervised, and monitored on video to make sure they do not wake people up in the middle of the night and force them to engage in human cockfighting. That's the answer. That's what the problem was, right? They had to be retrained, more intensely supervised, and monitored on video to ensure that they understand that forcing human beings to engage in human cockfighting is abusive, it's criminal, and that when such behavior is witnessed or discovered, they should take immediate action to stop and prevent further harm. Okay, now, here's the, now, in the United States, the funding for this facility was in doubt, right? Was in question. So the federal authorities swoop in, they investigate all 13 facilities, and they're all determined to be in immediate jeopardy. And immediate jeopardy means, I should get my language, but essentially it basically means that the people living there are in immediate jeopardy of serious injury, harm, impairment, or death, okay? So I thought, oh my gosh, immediate jeopardy. They're going to do something. That's not what immediate jeopardy means. Immediate jeopardy means that they're in immediate jeopardy of losing their federal funding. In the state of Texas, this is the illusion of protection, right, of what we're doing. In the state of Texas, the 13 state-supported living centers have been under oversight since 2009. Nothing fundamentally has changed about the lives for those individuals, nor the approach to what is the problem and the solutions. That's the illusion. This is the illusion of our systems. In 2018, an 8-part series was done on National Public Radio. You can get the link to that. abuse and betrayed, the sexual abuse epidemic no one wants to talk about. And, you know, we oftentimes hear that we need more data, we need more data, we need better data, right? We got to document the problem. I'm tired of documenting the problem. The problem is real. Talk to people in their lived experience. But what they did in this 8-part series is that NPR dug into the National Crime Victim Survey data and found, this is unpublished data, that people with intellectual disabilities are sexually assaulted at 7 times the rate of people without disabilities. In our meeting yesterday, I said 6, it's 7, right? And what that also means is that based upon the way we collect the data, that's an underestimate, right? That's right. How much more do you need? Yet, what was the response? We still are doing the same protective approaches, thinking they're going to work. And they are not going to work because we've diagnosed the problem wrong, which is going to get to Patsie and our work later. And so I leave you with these and other illusion of protection practices create a false sense of security and protection while doing little, if anything, to actually prevent interpersonal violence and protect, right? Yet these practices remain our predominant approach to interpersonal violence of people with intellectual disabilities, at least in the United States, perhaps where you live, in other parts of the world. And we must ask ourselves, why? Thank you.
Again, sorry, I just said a challenging and confronting session, but a very thought-provoking one. And raised lots of questions and kind of reflections for me, Nancy. And yeah, just reiterate our message for people to take care of themselves. I almost forgot to introduce the next speaker as someone that has had a really long relationship with the Donald Beasley Institute and with myself and with our team, but across the learning disability research world. So I'd just like to introduce Associate Professor Patsie Frawley, a recent, I guess, you know, person who floated back to their homeland from having a bit of a 4 years here in Aotearoa. So Patsie is with the National Centre of Excellence, Intellectual Disability Health at the University of New South Wales. And she is an expert on inclusive research in people with learning disabilities, disability abuse and violence, and sexual and reproductive rights, and has a long career in this area, as Nancy does. So welcome.
Thank you
Again.
Thanks,
Nancy,
Bridget.
and over to you.
I think it's funny that Bridget nearly forgot to introduce me because it just goes to show how used to each other we are. Thank you very much, Bridget. Thanks, Nancy. So I just want to start by saying that I probably don't need to say too much after Nancy's presentation to convince you perhaps, or to highlight that vulnerability for people with an intellectual disability is not something within people with an intellectual disability, which is the title of my presentation, is about questioning, challenging and changing ideas of inherent vulnerability. And I don't look up words as much as Nancy does, but she made me look it up the other day. And that inherent really does mean within. So what I'm hoping to do is, I guess, lead on from Nancy's presentation and look at ways that we can question that and that questioning is occurring. Look at ways that this idea is being challenged. And I'm particularly going to draw briefly, but on 2 inquiries, one in my country and one here in Aotearoa. And then I'm going to talk about how do we change this. And I guess we're all here today as part of that change. I think the work of the Donald Beasley Institute over, is it 40 years, Bridget, has been a really significant part of that change. I believe in my work and the people I work alongside, particularly people with intellectual disabilities, have and continue to be part of that change. And I'm going to look particularly today at how people with intellectual disabilities are doing that change and how perhaps we, whoever we are in this space today, can think about how we might partner with people, and in my world, people with intellectual disabilities, but many of you probably work across and in collaboration and in solidarity with a range of people for whom you could do this work. So onwards and upwards. Oh, that did work. Now, it's a really bad idea to start with quoting yourself, but I am. I just realized I was thinking, oh my gosh, it's the first thing I say. So my starting point, and I don't want to go too back, as Bridget said, I've been doing this a long time. So thanks, Bridget. I think the grey hair gives it away anyway. But yeah, 3 decades at least of my life, I've been working alongside people with intellectual disabilities in many different places and spaces and experiences in their life. But I always go back to one of the first experiences of mine where I was trying to put myself through a postgraduate course in intellectual disability. And there was a big institution in the city that I moved to, and it was around the corner from where I was renting a house, you know, flatting, as you would say. And that big institution was called Kew Cottages. And this was about 1980, I don't know, 2, I'll say, something like that. So I turned up and they had a school there, believe it or not. They were into education at that stage, and all the people there were adults. And like many things that happen in the disability service world, someone had been somewhere else and brought these ideas back to Kew and to Victoria's approach to disability and said, let's say that we're providing education to everyone. In actual fact, the education was a very restrictive program of, it was called something like computer-based programming of people or something like that. It was very strange. Of course, we had computers in those days took up almost a whole room. What that computer would do would spit out a task like putting your shoes on. And what the teachers were doing in this education space was essentially doing a program of training people to put their shoes on. And that could go on for a year for a person or longer. And I also recall one person who I was working with, who I was assigned to, you had to fill out on a clipboard, you had to tick if they got it right, you know, whatever. And you walked around with an apron on that had all these things in the pockets like lollies and other things that people might like for positive reinforcement. So people would be familiar with Pavlov's dog, this idea that we train people. And I still remember one man I worked with, he was a wheelchair user, he was nonverbal, and his program was to respond to the command, come here. That was his. And I was assigned to work with him. So I quickly worked out what he liked eating and what he liked doing. And I would just pull them out of my pocket and say, come on, have those, want to go for a walk? And we'd go for a walk. And I'd check everything on the clipboard and he'd be a big smile and off we go into the garden. So I sort of thwarted that system for as long as I could. Anyway, that's why maybe I'm starting with my own quote, but this quote comes from, I think, one of the greatest privileges I ever had in my working life, which was to be a witness at the Disability Royal Commission in Victoria, in Australia, twice. And on the second time, I said this: there's this cascading, devaluing, discounting that picks up and grows with momentum to the point when we hear about the abuse, and this particular hearing was about women with intellectual disabilities, we don't turn to the same sorts of answers or ways of describing and understanding it. We go straight to ideas of vulnerable. It's your difference that made this happen. And I said this when I had that opportunity because I thought, this commission's going to hear thousands of stories, which it did. And I knew it was framed by human rights and intersectionality and even a social ecological model of abuse. But I just wanted to put centre stage a queering, a questioning, a critiquing of the idea of vulnerable within, because all of those stories could be heard in a different way. They could be heard in a way that would say it's the vulnerability is about intellectual disability. So I just wanted to sort of say that. And I said it, I think, in, I don't know, memory of, and, you know, thinking about all those people I'd worked with for 30 odd years. I didn't stay in the institution long, by the way. It was only to get me through uni. But I actually did end up working with more of those young people in my next job. It was for supporting adults with disabilities, and on and on and on. So there's my quote about me. I want to move on now and just really briefly talk about what is the landscape that all of our questioning is happening within. And so I'm still on the questioning here. And the landscape's really important to think about because it's where we should take our questions. What is going on here? How do people understand vulnerability of people with disabilities, and in particular people with intellectual disability? And probably, I won't read through the points, but I think the key point for me is it's still used as a single reason for the violence that people are experiencing. They are vulnerable. And you hear it over and over and over again. And these notions of inherent vulnerability, as Nancy has said, have set up systems of residential services, institutions, as Bridget has said, I think, in the Royal Inquiry here, that are places of abuse. Yet they continue. And these things are often away from society and out of the public gaze. And many of us who work with people and have worked in some of these places and alongside people who've had to live these lives in places sometimes forget that because we've got such a close gaze of this, we sometimes forget that the public gaze is nowhere near it. They just don't know. They just don't understand. And they haven't had much contact or relationship with people with intellectual disabilities. So they probably think these places are protective. They're the right places, they're the right models. Government knows what they're doing, off we go. But Nancy's presentation, and I think you can certainly understand through the work of the Donald Beasley Institute over a long time and the Royal Inquiry into Abuse here, these places are the places of risk. So I won't keep going on about that. The other thing about, I think, the public understanding is that particularly for intellectual disability, understanding intellectual disability, there's a sense that people are forever dependent and absolutely incapable of learning, thinking, making decisions, aspiring to life and being an equal human being alongside other people. And it's these ideas that keep that vulnerability story going. I now want to just quickly and respectfully reflect on an experience here in Aotearoa when I was living here, when Lena Zhang Harrop was raped and murdered in Auckland, when she was going for her daily walk in a park. And again, something she did daily. She was a young woman going for a walk. And this is what was reported. Her physical impairments, the combination with her diagnosis of Down syndrome, and the associated impairments that came with that placed her in a degree of vulnerability that was not seen in a number of comparable cases presented to the court. What does that mean? What is that saying to the public? It's saying her vulnerability was within. She had Down syndrome. She was diagnosed with an intellectual disability. This is why she was vulnerable. Further reports of that case identified that the perpetrator was someone who was hanging around the park waiting to rape a woman. And the day before, there was a jogger who got away. The next day, it was Lena. And there was no analysis of the perpetrator. There was no gender-based violence analysis around this. It went straight to this young woman was vulnerable because that's how she's diagnosed as a vulnerable person. Now, there's been a lot of critique of this, and I'm not the first person to do it, and I won't be the last, I hope. I think this should go on. And this is a very good paper by Pritchard Jones. And again, this is coming from a UK perspective, but I think you'll recognise some similarities with some of the ways in which protection is actually framed in Aotearoa and in Australia. Pritchard Jones calls it a status-based label of vulnerability. So status-based, intellectual disability equals vulnerability. That's your status forever. And she says there's a real problem with this because it leads to the poorly defined responses, the kinds of things Nancy said, to that perceived vulnerability. So for people, particularly with intellectual disability, responses to experiences of violence and abuse or perceived vulnerability to violence abuse go in one direction and one direction only: safeguard. And if we had time to unpack that word, I think we'd find that it has been rarely used or applied in a way that has actually safeguarded anybody. What it might have done is put some restrictions around the person, and it might most often, for people with intellectual disability, it leads to someone else making decisions in their life. So substitute decision-making, guardianship, etc. How does that safeguard anyone against these environments that that do not see these people as people, and that are places that have been given the power to restrict, given the power to take away decision-making, given the power to take away personhood, to take away the humanity of people? So I think we've really got to look at these status-based ideas of vulnerability and those responses, particularly that maybe are said to be around safeguarding. In Australia, they use the quality and safeguarding mechanism within the now sort of, I don't know, the National Disability Insurance Scheme that went to the bottom of the ocean and is now being dragged back up looking like something else with a whole heap of kelp hanging off it. But, you know, and that's all about, oh, it's all right, we're going to safeguard everyone this time. It's all going to be good. But of course, we know what happens with that. I just want to also say that particularly for women with intellectual disability, what this safeguarding has actually meant has been sterilisation, taking away reproductive rights, and as I said, substitute decision-making, and I think a whole myriad of restrictive practices across the lives of people with intellectual disabilities. So moving to challenging. So I just want to really quickly say where I see the challenging that's happened in your country and mine in the last few years is within these state-based inquiries that have had a deep dive into the stories of people. And in Australia, it was actually a Royal Commission into violence and abuse of people with disabilities. So it was a Disability Royal Commission. And before I moved here 4 years ago or so, I was involved with a large number of people in Australia who got behind this and said, this is what we need. And we were really pleased it happened, and it went for 4 years. You mightn't be able to see this, but there was nearly 8,000 submissions received, nearly 18,000 phone inquiries, a number of papers published, a whole lot of responses, and a whole lot of private sessions as well. There were 222 recommendations. And one of the things that's important about the way Australia went about this is they said straight up, we're looking at systems, housing, disability services, health, governance of services, education, and experiences for Indigenous people. And that to me said right from the start, great, you know, I was happy about that. They were really going to frame what was going on within this systemic approach. They did it, and they did it really well. However, there are 222 recommendations, and the government about 2 months ago agreed to fully support 13 of them, 13 out of 222. And they were the low-hanging fruit. They were the things that were already in place. So whilst there's recommendations to close special schools, no, that's off. Reframe, reimagine, restructure, hopefully completely deconstruct segregated disability services. It's off the agenda as well. They had every opportunity to do really strong systemic change and change the landscape. They haven't. I'm back in Australia now, and I thought I was going back to somewhere that's going to be, hey, look at all these good things that the government said we can do. Instead, we're back to fight and can keep fighting but from a strong platform, I think. I just wanted to share what one person with a disability said in this in a submission. She said, and this is Summer Frawley, she said, inclusion means that we don't look at a person based on the risk factors which exist. We look at a person based on the value they provide and the right they have to be their authentic self autonomously. So this is a person, you know, using those words. I know I'm seen as a risk factor because I have a disability. Don't look at me that way. And this is a young 15-year-old saying this. So let's have a listen to that and keep listening to that, I suppose I would say. I won't go into the work here at all because I know Bridget's going into this of the inquiry here in a couple of weeks' time, I think, or next week at a forum. Suffice to say that I think the same kind of analysis is happening, a systemic analysis here, an analysis that's looked at the stories of these people and said, it's not them, it's not within, it is in the systems that they're in. And I heard on the radio this morning, I think it was people from deaf schools. I think I was right in hearing that whilst knowing that there's going to be a public apology have said, well, it's not really enough. We need to hold the people who were in these systems to account and the systems to account. So, you know, I guess we're on the same trajectory, hopefully across the ditch from each other, and that we can learn and help each other. Just going to have a quick sip. How much longer I got, Libby? Have a nice sip. Thank you. So one of the other ways that I get involved in changing this story is to work alongside people with intellectual disability to what I call changing the narrative. And I've been lucky enough to do that here with the Donald Beasley Institute in two really great projects, one called Mean As, and the other one was Tell Me About You, which Bridget will be speaking about. That informed the Royal Inquiry into Abuse. And then one in the middle is a program that I've been associated with for about 20 years in Australia called Sexual Lives and Respectful Relationships. What I want to say about this work and why I've used narrative research for many years now, for at least 20 years, is that so the first time that I came into this work is Professor Kelly Johnson, who some of you might know, and she's been here as well. It seems like absolutely everybody has been to the Donald Beasley Institute, who I like. And now I have, I don't know, that means I like myself, but oh, look, I'm sorry, something's happened to my view here. So I'll just go back, sorry. There we go. I can't see that, but I don't suppose that matters. Sorry for those listening, I'm just messing up the computer thing here. So the narrative research, so about 24 years ago, actually, Kelly Johnson came back from the UK and said, you know what, they're doing some pretty cool research in the UK of narrative life story work. Dorothy Atkinson, she been here? No, okay. Dorothy Atkinson did a whole lot of work with people coming out of institutions just to work alongside them and tell their stories. Powerful, very powerful. Of course, most research up to then had possibly been done about people, definitely been done about people without their themselves being truly within the research. So this was kind of a great opportunity. So we dived in and we did research with 25 people with intellectual disabilities in Australia, telling their stories about sexuality and relationships. And we chose, you know, we didn't choose actually, that wasn't something we chose, of course. I was led by the mother of inclusive research, Kelly Johnson and Jan Wormsley, and she was there telling me, well, we need to go talk to people to see what they want to do their research about in their lives. And they chose sexuality and relationships. Just so happened to also align with a whole lot of public health work around safe sex, the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So we began that process. And we took 5 years to work with people to help, you know, to tell their stories. Then we worked with a research group of people with intellectual disabilities to say, what do you want to do with this? We turned it into some workshops for training, education for people with intellectual disabilities, staff in services and families. And that was published and, you know, ran all, we couldn't get it published in Australia, actually it was published in the UK under Pavilion. And then Kelly then took it off around the world. So that was my learning about the strength of narrative research and inclusive research, working alongside people with intellectual disability to set the research agenda, to have their voice in it, literally in their stories, and then to work with how to use those stories. So fast forward, I don't know, a number of years, maybe 15 years, a bit less. I was working somewhere else. And I'd continued to sort of be involved in sexuality research with people with intellectual disabilities. And an opportunity came to revisit that work and think about it as a violence prevention approach. And so I gathered a group of, well, the people who I've worked with forever around me, people with intellectual disabilities. And they said, we want to continue to tell our stories and we want to be the people doing the teaching, doing the educating. So we developed a peer education program. And that's been going in one place that I'll talk about in a moment for 15 years and is now a fully fledged community-based project in ran through a centre against sexual assault. Anyway, back to the others as well. Mean As is a really important community resource to all of you here and in the world because it's on the Donald Beasley website. It's 7 stories co-developed with people with an intellectual disability that tell about their lives, but again, with a real focus on relationships. What I think is really fantastic about MENAS is that there was a group of people with intellectual disabilities who were the researchers. They would listen to these stories, they would reflect, they theorized. Their theory, their ideas are in the report that sits as an advocacy tool with this resource. So stories are important. The book that Nancy and I will talk about in a moment that got us going in 1994 by Dick Sobsey starts with a story of a person with an intellectual disability and their experiences of abuse. The person is from New Zealand because Dick Sobsey finished this book at the Donald Beasley Institute, of course. So these stories are really important, and we've got some resources that we give. There's a list that Umi will share with you. There's a few papers there that I've worked alongside people with intellectual disabilities to write about how to do this narrative research in ways that people can tell their own stories, but also in these areas that other people that would just absolutely shut people down about. Don't talk about sex, don't talk about relationships. People will disclose abuse. And they do. And the people I've worked alongside who are peer educators have said, we can handle this. We're here to help each other. We all need to be able to talk about our experiences. And so, yes, they do lead to disclosures. Yes, they do lead to deep thinking and sharing of experiences amongst people with intellectual disabilities, but they also lead to change, and they put it into the hands of people with an intellectual disability. So I can't, I just wanted to sort of finish off by saying that's something we can all do. And I was thinking about this as a critical disability studies forum, and the researchers amongst you here and in Zoom land, think about this. And whoever you are working with, particularly for people with intellectual disabilities, their voices have been closed down forever. And narrative research can change that. The power of stories, we all know about the power of stories, but also the power of working with people to unpack those stories, particularly in relation to challenging ideas of vulnerability. They don't say, I'm a vulnerable person. They say things like what I've shared here in the MENAS part. I want you to carry on, keep loving yourself, get sleep, be loved and appreciated. I want you to carry on and be a strong person. So this story, sometimes I write letters, is like the best little resource about working with someone who's experienced abuse. And it comes from the voice of a person with an intellectual disability and the theorizing of people with intellectual disabilities alongside it. I won't say more about our program, but basically one thing to say is that when we established peer ed as the model, it just looked after itself. My job was really just to keep supporting people with intellectual disabilities to engage and to work out how they wanted to do that peer education. And of course, Tell Me About You has been a strongest advocacy tool in the Royal Inquiry here. One very last thing, I suppose, is just to say that I've carried on this work with some colleagues in Scandinavia, and Norway and Sweden. They came to Australia. They found out about sexual lives and respect for relationships. They liked it. That was a number of years ago now. They've taken it to Norway and Sweden. And I went over there earlier this year to see how it was going. And one funny thing they said when they were introducing me is, this is Patsie Frawley. She's the grandmother of VIP, which is what they call SLNR. I wasn't sure how to take that, but, I took it. Why I'm sharing this with you as a parting gift around thinking about how we change the narrative around vulnerability is that these are people with intellectual disabilities who had been not included at all in what was a whole of a government-funded program that existed for every single other person in Scandinavia to learn about their sexuality rights and consent and those kinds of things, but nothing had ever been done for people with intellectual disabilities. Now this is funded in every municipality in Norway and most municipalities in Sweden. It's run by local government. It's not run by disability services, in partnership with people with intellectual disabilities. And one of the things I just wanted to say is when I went there, they were talking about developing peer ed, and a woman with an intellectual disability said to me, I've done this course 3 times. Now I want to run it. And I was so buoyed by that. And whilst it's not called a violence prevention program, it is. Sexual lives and respect for relationships was framed in that way. This isn't, but it does the same thing. It actually says people with intellectual disabilities can and should be thinking about and sharing their ideas about themselves in their lives, in their relationships, and they can help each other out with that. So one person said, it's one of the most important things you learn from this is maybe to say yes to what's important to you and no to what you don't want. So finally, just the reminder, and I guess where we segue into our next presentation, it's about society's response. As Dick Sobesy says, it's about society's response to disability, maybe the more important than the disability itself in increasing vulnerability, and may imply that intervention must be aimed primarily at systems rather than individuals. He said that 20 years ago. We're still saying it now. Let's hope we don't have to say it for too much longer. Let's hope that what's happened in your country, my country, with these inquiries can be used to continue to show how it just doesn't work to say that people by themselves within are vulnerable. I want to leave you with a quote from Kate Eastman, who I hold her in great esteem. She was the legal counsel at the Disability Royal Commission in Australia, and she was incredible. She said, we'll make little progress until we recognise ableism and the intersecting forms of inequality and discrimination that are underlying drivers of violence and abuse of women and girls with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Patsy. Hopefully I've got this on. And for everyone that is joining us online, I have no way of knowing whether we're in the frame or not. We are? Yes? Okay. Okay, now. Again, thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Patsy. Amazing presentations, challenging, confronting presentations. We have a few minutes for questions, if anyone has questions in the room or online, and then we might have a short break before we come back for the final part of the day. So any questions from the room? Ruth?
So when we deal with these really important topics that are they kind of hurt us as well as we're listening to them, I wonder how can we make that shift from being impacted at a personal level across to the institution, and the systems, the broader practices. Do you have any sort of ways? You've given us some beautiful case studies, but I just wondered if you had some more advice.
Oh, I'll start. Yeah, I do. And I mean, it's going to be really simple. I think it's about collaborating and connecting with the people who we know these injustices are happening for and with still, and doing work with them, and in my world, that means doing research with people that is led by people, and that not only gets done, but gets translated. So I'm lucky at the moment. I'm working in a national centre, and that's my job, is knowledge translation about health and intellectual disability. And when you stop and think about that, you think, why should we be told to do that? Like, why do I have to have a job that's called that? But I do think that, Ruth, it's about us all taking the responsibility, no matter who we are and what we're doing. But if you're a researcher, how does it change? It's the so what that we end up with. So it's about the collaborations and working alongside people in the research and work we do. It's then talking about what can we do with this to make the change. And we don't always have big public inquiries every year. We've had them, once in many, many years. So we can't think that's the only way. And I'm always really, I think, inspire is not the right word, but, I really feel like people with disabilities themselves are very much finding ways to make those changes through, using technology and media and those kinds of things. I think it's about getting behind that. And if you're in a position to fund projects, if you're in the position to support people with disabilities, to get involved in things that can make a change, do that. If you're a support worker, if you're a policy maker, think about ways that you can create those opportunities, because they don't exist naturally. They just don't. professors and other people at universities get research grants, not normally self-advocacy groups. But if you join together, you can share that and begin to create those ways of making change, I think. I don't know if that answered it, Ruth, but it's certainly where I come from. Yeah. Nancy?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I'm just going to say that the screen is right around here. That's in part is what our presentation will be afterwards, taking the flipped social ecological model and talking about how we approach doing this work differently. Because my experience, and we'll profile some of the work, but my experience in doing this work starting, I'm trying to think where I've lived, but 30 some years ago, I guess, was that the change isn't going to happen from within disability systems and services. It's just not. They still are on the same trajectory that's always been on. We may tweak. Where we see progress, and this is what we're going to be profiling in our book, and why we're writing the book that we're working on, is to start to profile where the work is being done differently. And part of the reason the work is being done differently is because the problem and the solutions are being framed very differently. And I think that goes back to thinking about vulnerability and what makes people more vulnerable, and really calling out this notion of inherent vulnerability, this notion that it comes from within, that it's about the person. And I wrote this down in response to, I hope this is kind of getting at, but the reason we spend a lot of time reframing and trying to help people rethink, because the messages about the problem are deeply ingrained, and we're going to talk about ableism later. It's deeply ingrained in how we think about disability within our society and our systems. And just like in any kind of isms and right, and where we're not questioning. So some of this is about really just critically questioning what you believe. So, when you think about like status-based vulnerability, means that we maintain the status quo in our response. I thought the status stays, right? And the way that we dissect individual vulnerability of individuals, both individually and collectively as people with intellectual disabilities, what does that mean? It means that we excuse individuals, services, and systems from doing anything any different than what we do, because we can't do anything different, because that's just the way it is, right? But once, I think Patsie and I have been sharing similar stories, like of our origin work. Once I stepped outside of disability system and services and started talking with people who did community-based victim advocate work, that did domestic sexual violence advocate work and domestic violence, and they started critically questioning, like, what? Like, you do what? Like, how that works? Like, when people said, it sounds like what you do in your services through compliance-based training is grooming people to be easy targets. And that was just, woo. So I think that part of this work, and we'll talk more in our presentation afterwards, is it's about engaging the community and people who understand doing this work differently and thinking and doing this work differently. And that I think is what's going to break the silos in the systems. It's not going to come from within, and really just critically questioning and challenging and calling it out, like, is what we're going to need to do at all of those levels. But it can't be done in a siloed way anymore, right? We do it in community across people with shared vision and values and interests. That's the way that it will change, from my estimation.
Thank you, Nancy. I think we are sort of coming to our break time in the seminar, and we'll take a quick sort of 10-minute break. So everyone online, thank you for being here, and take a quick break. We will be back in 10 minutes time and have the final part of the session where Nancy and Patsie bring this together in terms of a discussion around the ecological model. So thank you, and we'll be back soon. Kia ora, everyone. If we could just start getting back to our places. Thank you. Kia ora everyone online. We're just getting people returned to their places in the room, and we'll get started again. Okay, welcome back everyone to our final third part of the session today. And this part of the presentation is called Unpacking a Flipped Social Ecological Model, Violence Prevention in People with Intellectual Disability. And it draws on the work that Patsie and Nancy are doing together at the moment for the purposes of a new book together. So probably pulling together research in a different way. And so we welcome you back and thank you. And we'll just try and be a little conscious of being in frame. There you go, Patsie.
Thank you. Thanks. For some reason, this slide only has, oh no, we've got Nancy's name there too, which is great. So thank you for your attention thus far today. Those of you in Zoom land, we just had really great food. So thanks for that. And I hope you found a biscuit in your cupboard or something. So yeah, this second part is to talk about the way in which Nancy and I have worked using a model that Professor Dick Sobsey from Canada first presented, I guess, to the world in this book called Violence and Abuse in the Lives of People with Disabilities, The End of Silent Acceptance with a question mark in 1994. My connection with this was that I went to a conference in Melbourne and Dick Sobsey was speaking, and I can't remember where I was working at the time, but I knew that this was an issue that was something I needed to do about my work with people with intellectual disabilities. And I remember looking down at my notebook and he started talking and I looked up and I never stopped looking up, I think, and listening to this work. It made such perfect sense to me. Nancy, I will say, I met her and her work through her book, which she published in 2009, which was called Combating of People. Yeah.
Violence and abuse in the lives of people with disabilities, a call to action.
And I again looked up and I read that book a lot, and I invited Nancy to Australia, where we had just embarked on Sexual Lives and Respectful Relationships, the peer ed program I was talking to you about earlier, and I'll talk about a little bit more. So right now, many, many years later, Nancy and I reconnected over an offer that was made about whether I wanted to think about putting a book proposal together. And I immediately thought of Nancy, and I immediately thought about the work we've been doing in different parts of the world. And I hadn't realised, but it's 20 years since Dick Sobsey wrote, 30 years since Dick, yep, I wish it was 20, wrote this book. And it's been pivotal in our work. So I thought there's an opportunity. So that's what we've done. What we're doing, I wish we'd done it. We haven't quite done it. Nancy's been in Australia with me for the last couple of weeks, and we've been workshopping this book like nothing on earth. So it's nice to be able to sort of pull it together a little bit with you today. It's not just about the book, obviously. We both left you with slides from our last presentation about why we think this work is important and why we think it's important and where to with it. From Nancy's talking about illusion of protection and practices that create a false sense of security and protection, that we have to think about practices that are these predominant approaches and how they are still impacting interpersonal violence. And we have to ask ourselves why. For me, I left you with the quote from Helen Eastman, who was one of the legal counsel for the Disability Royal Commission, and where she particularly identified ableism and intersecting forms of inequality and discrimination, and thinking about and addressing drivers of abuse. So we're going to talk with you through some ecological models, so social ecological models, which as an introduction are really just systems models that tie everything together from the individual to society and back in and out again. And I'm going to pass over to Nancy, who's going to start that conversation with you, and we'll be doing a little bit of a Nancy Patsie show in this presentation, and we've got to stand here. I remember that.
Okay, so this is on and you can use the microphone here. Good. Okay. So I think before I do that, what I want to say one quick thing about this book, 30 years in. So this is like a seminal book. It is the book. It's Bridget's book, but we all have this. You can get it on the used market. But the bad news about this book is that if you read it today, aside from some language changes and some dates and updated research, things have not fundamentally changed. So I'm just going to quickly sort of introduce the World Health Organization's using the socio-ecological model. So that's the model we use. And so this is the general model of interpersonal violence prevention work used by WHO. And so basically what the model says is there's no single factor that can explain why some people or groups are at higher risk of interpersonal violence and why others are more protected from it. Okay, so it's this framework of violence that we basically look at that says it's the outcome of interactions at these 4 levels. We have to look at things in the context of the society, within community, within relationships, within the individual, right? They intersect. And so this is just the basic framework for the work. And then and you'll have access to the slides, and it just talks about like what some of these factors are at these different levels that contribute to increased risk. Now, let's move on to how this model has been used. And so it's my left, I'm not sure what side it is, but it's the model that says culture on the top and then environment relationships, right? So that's Sabzi's model that comes in his book. It's called the Integrated Ecological Model of Abuse. And this is how he proposed that the dynamics of abuse work for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And the point of that really is, again, just for you to think about and look at. We don't have time to dissect the layers, but to think about and look at, again, the social ecological model of how we see these different layers interacting and associating and how we use them to understand both the problem. On the other side of the screen is a model, again, based off the social ecological model, and it's really based off the work of Sabzi that Andrea Hollematz did. She's out of the UK, and this is her model specifically centering on sexual assault against people with learning disabilities, which would be intellectual disability in my country. And again, you see like this individual within the context, right? And how, and her writings, and she has a book that she wrote with this and some articles that again sort of show us and look at the layers and the interaction between these systems that contribute to this vulnerability, right?
So I'm just going to speak a little bit about the model that we developed in Australia. You can see it's got the layers, it's got, I'll describe it, it's, my colleague used to call it the onion. So it's layers and layers like an onion. And so what we did is we used the ecological model that has been used to understand violence and abuse to think about how we apply that to prevent violence and abuse. So essentially, the model is the same. The inner circle is the individual. The next circle out is about relationships. The next circle out is about community. The next circle out is about society. And how we perceived of this together with the people with intellectual disability who worked in our team for, some of them for 15 years, and some came and went, was to think about, if we're preventing violence, what do we need to do with people in terms of people with an intellectual disability? And the overwhelming message was we put people with intellectual disabilities at the centre of this as change agents. And how do we do this when we're talking about a prevention really program, is we create the role of peer educator. So people with intellectual disabilities are holding the knowledge, they're holding the way of translating that knowledge through education, and they're there for each other. And they're rarely being perceived in those sorts of roles. So it really did change the way that people with intellectual disability were being seen within the context of violence prevention, particularly because violence prevention really with people with intellectual disability in most of the years of my work up until this time had been about stranger danger education, very basic, very peeled back, because, you know, people with intellectual disability wouldn't be able to understand the complexities of gender-based violence or anything, of course. So, you know, just beware of strangers. And as we know, most of the abuse experienced by people with intellectual disability is not, the perpetrators are not strangers. So we changed that. We used at that individual level through the peer education, it's the stories that I talked about earlier. Those stories actually form the program, and people with intellectual disabilities would sit around like they do with the Mean As work, in fact, and talk about those stories and then say, what are the key messages that come from these stories that we want to share in our education work with our peers? The grey one is the learning partner. And at the break, someone asked me about, well, what can disability services do? Are they part of this ecosystem of change? And absolutely they are. And what we perceived of in this model was that we would invite people into our work who are in the lives of people with intellectual disabilities and who want to be supportive of change, who want to address drivers of abuse with them. So we established this layer, and it's the relationship layer of an ecological model, where we invited parents, carers, support workers in to learn alongside the people who came to do the program. They didn't come into the room, but they were given a book that the peer educators developed with all the key messages in it that they could have to use in support of the work that the individuals were doing in the groups. The blue layer was a really important layer for us. And I do remember the very moment where I thought, I know what we have to do here. So I'd worked with Family Planning Victoria for a long time as a sexuality educator. I had worked with sexual assault services in the state of Victoria, developing the first set of training and information and resource development to work for workers in that sector to work with people with intellectual disabilities, and a report on sexual abuse of people with intellectual disabilities. So I was kind of centred in that work. And I knew that they did great work. I knew that every single centre against sexual assault that I worked with in those years were doing the very best they could for everybody who came to or through their door. But what they thought was they weren't doing it well enough, because they didn't feel really fully equipped to work with people with intellectual disabilities as well as they thought they should. However, I thought they were doing a great job. And I thought the principles of their work that were feminist-based work to change violence were great principles for working effectively with people with intellectual disabilities as well. So we developed this model and said, we're inviting them in as well. And what we did was we set up sites across Australia in the end, and we would go to those centres. So we would go and we'd do an information session to see if people with intellectual disabilities were interested, and usually recruit new peer educators in a particular region or town. And we would talk to the services in those towns, the family violence, sexual violence services, and say, do you want to come along and do this work? Then we would train them and the peer educators together to run the programs in their areas. And that has been sustained now, which I'll talk about in a little while, in one community in Victoria called Gippsland. The Gippsland Centre Against Sexual Assault have been doing this for 15 years. And the program now is ran through their centre. They employ people with intellectual disabilities as peer educators. Their staff are the staff doing the work. And it's situated within the broader society, which is that outer layer, where they are now part of the community work around violence and abuse, like Reclaim the Night marches and other community campaigns. This program is a central part of it, and it's seen as a part of the work of Gippsland Centre Against Sexual Assault. So everyone's got a role here, and this model has done its bit, and it's now doing more because that particular centre has just got some funding to progress it further for 3 years. So that's that model, and it's just an example to share with you about how an ecological model can work in prevention with people with intellectual disabilities. And it actually does reflect the model that Nancy showed earlier of the World Health Organization, that says there's a place for everyone in this, but we all need to do it together. And that for us, for me, people with an intellectual disability are the centre of it. So that's that model. But I'm going to hand over to Nancy now to take it back out a bit.
Okay. So, yep, when you hear the word prevention, I think we need, so we're not talking protection, we're talking prevention. So it's helpful to say a little bit about violence prevention work, right? And so some of you may be familiar with public health approach to violence prevention work, and looks at how we go upstream. So we see our stream, right? How we go upstream to address the conditions that impact downstream outcomes for individuals, families, groups, and communities, right? And we understand and recognize that those upstream conditions, what we may call the structural and social determinants of health and well-being, those upstream conditions, can create positive outcomes downstream. They can also create negative outcomes downstream or some combination thereof, right? So we're talking about moving our work upstream. And so in violence prevention work, right, at the top, we aim to change the upstream conditions before harm is perpetrated through primary prevention, right? So we need to engage in that kind of work. And through outreach to people in communities most at risk to ideally prevent, but if not, to intervene early. And that would be our secondary prevention. And as we move down the stream, right, it is tertiary prevention, but it is where we are doing crisis prevention, crisis response, long-term response, right? Harm has already been perpetrated. And here is where we really have to think about, do we have effective response systems that are trauma-informed, victim-centered, right? That promote healing for the individuals and accountability for the perpetrators. And that's the upstream model. And some of you may be familiar with the river story.
I'm just going to come in here and just say, in relation to that tertiary, Donald Beasley Institute are doing a really important piece of work funded by the Health Research Council about co-developing a treaty-based disabled women-led model that is about enhancing and understanding how services can be responsive, fully responsive at that point that is about responding. So you can talk to Bridget about that. I happen to be in that team as well. So I just wanted to give it a little bit of a plug.
Thank you, Patsie. Now, this slide, and I'll explain a little bit of parts of it, but we really want to think about the drivers of violence in the lives of people with disabilities. And it comes from what I think is one of the most seminal pieces of reading, pieces of work, product that I've seen in a really long time. Thanks to Patsie sharing, like this really is anchoring the work that we're doing in our book, Changing the Landscape, and it's a national resource to prevent violence against women and girls with disabilities that comes out of Victoria in Australia. And we can think about this model not specifically just for women and girls, right? We can think about it much more broadly. So as we look at the model, and what it really basically says for people with disabilities is we have to understand ableism and the ableist drivers of violence. And there's 4 on the screen. Negative stereotypes about people with disabilities, accepting or normalizing violence, disrespect, and discrimination against people with disabilities, controlling people with disabilities' decision-making, and limiting independence, which I like to say autonomy. Independence is such a loaded word in the system, right? And social segregation and exclusion of people with disabilities. So as you think about where are the sources of vulnerability, we really have to think about how ableism is playing out in people's lives. Now that ableism intersects, right, with other forms of oppression. Now, this diagram here looks at ableism intersecting with gender inequality, but think about how ableism intersects, right, with the gender drivers of violence, ageism, classism, racism, and colonialism, and other forms of oppression. So it very much is understanding this from an intersectional lens in terms of how do we understand. But from our vantage point, the violence against people with intellectual disabilities and other disabilities must be understood within the context of ableism and the ableist drivers. And while Dick Sobsey isn't talking about ableism, it's very clear that those are the drivers without being named. Okay, so that has not fundamentally changed. If we think about doing this work and how that is shaping and informing how we're approaching and thinking about doing this work, and I think how we shape and inform doing this work today, then it reminds us that of the importance of disability justice. And we picked this image from off the internet, but disability justice should be capitalized. So please know, because it's not disability justice, it is a framework, it is a movement specifically coming out of Sins Invalid in the United States. And it was a movement of people, Black and brown, Indigenous, queer folk, who said that in the advocacy activist movements in the United States, they were centered around whiteness and white people, exclusionary of other people's lived experiences. And so it comes out of the need to have a broad representation of lived experiences, disability justice, big D, big J. And it has these 10 principles, the definitions evolving and changing, but it's really important to think about, like, how do you do this work differently and I'm not going to walk through all of them, but as you see, as we start to profile this work, it is about cross-movement organizing, right? It's about how do you engage in communities. It is about leadership of the most impacted. Patsie's talking over and over again about people with intellectual disabilities being at the forefront, leading, right? Why that's so important. It is about interdependence, that we are all interdependent. There is no, right? It's about changing that. It's about, and when you see collective access, collective liberation, it says that this work is done in community. So it is aspirational, I think, but it is anchoring our thinking about how you go about doing this work with the intention of honoring the principles of disability justice as you can, and always continuing to see that there's always so much more work to do in that space. And this is Patsie.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. So Nancy and I, in thinking through this and having worked with ecological models ourselves for many, many years, as we started to write the book, we're like, oh, hang on, we think this needs flipping around. Because what we were talking about first and foremost was the societal change that's needed. And that if you think about the upstream, you think about the key drivers of violence and abuse. We talked about those first when we started talking about the book, after we'd written the proposal, of course. So now we have to change it around. And we said, why are we talking about this first when all the ecological models have individual in the middle? And the reason why we were is because we knew that often what happened was that if you focused at the individual level, you got stuck there. And you started thinking about, even if you were not thinking about changing individuals, and even if you were working in collaboration with people with intellectual disabilities to be leaders of change themselves, your work often got stuck there because you didn't have the tools and the platform to be really drawing it out into that social level, if that makes sense. You might connect it, as we did with Sexual Lives and Respectful Relationships. So every conference we presented at, every program we ran, every resource we developed, we drew it back out to that social level, but people saw the individual level all the time. So when Nancy and I now have this opportunity to write something about this in a book, we decided that we would flip the model. We should probably talk to people like Dick Sobsey about this as well, but it came from an article by Golden and others called Upending the Social Ecological Model to Guide Health Promotion Efforts Toward Policy and Environmental Change. And it was one of those aha moments, righto, let's try this. So we are trying this, but it's also thinking about this is an ecosystem, like that's what an ecological model is. And if you can start to identify changes at a social level that may not have been defined as violence prevention in disability areas of work, particularly self-advocacy, etc., you could start to bring people along on a bit of a conversation about how important it is to get behind those behind those pieces of work. Lots and lots of people say, oh, it's not my job to be doing violence prevention work. I'm not funded to do that. We're not funded to do that. We don't know how to do that. We work with people with intellectual disability in employment, in housing, in education. And like, okay, good, because that's where the change can happen. And that's where you can start to make those changes. So this is the logic, I think, of our approach here. Also, it clearly sets with an upstream model. And I think it really aligns very, very closely to self-advocacy and therefore enables really strong partnerships with people with intellectual disabilities in particular and other disabilities through their self-advocacy work. So what are we trying to look at the society level? It's non-ableist, socially just, human rights upheld, barrier-free, everything. And we've only really got to society and community. We need to go back to Sydney and do the rest of the work on relation and individual. We'll come back and update you on that, or you could read our book if we ever get it written. So I'm just going to hand over to, I just should say that we conceived of this book and said it's not about us, it's not about what we think, it's about what people are doing. So the whole book is chapter by chapter on each of these levels, and we just profile really good pieces of work that are going on that connect to those levels. And I said to Umi, I think the other day, you know, what I think is important, maybe it's because I'm old and I've been around a while, is that you just want to become invisible in doing this work because other people are doing it and they're the people who are going to keep it going. So that's what we're really hoping to do in the profiling of this too. I'm going to hand over to Nancy, who's going to talk about a couple of key approaches that we are highlighting, but we're going to run out of time, so we might be.
We have 5 minutes?
Yes,
Oh, okay. That's okay. You're going to give me a 2.5 minute, right? So as I said, we've really been focusing a lot on the societal level with this flipped model. And actually, this is the driver of the work. Everything flows from this. So upstream to change ableist laws, policies, and practices. Funding streams are so important. Social systems and social norms and attitudes. And so when the chapter is going to be thinking about what are rights limiting ableist drivers, right, at the societal level, and what are rights promoting, because there's two sides to this, right? And the rights limiting are very much rooted in the ableism and what we need to do to address that. And we really are centering around how do you, for supporting people with intellectual disabilities to become a public and political life, right? Become the fabric of that. And so, I mean, I'm gonna, so a lot of this work is policy work and changing ableist policies and systems. And so how do we do that? We're going to profile like policy change. And for example, the Partners in Policymaking is a program in the United States, comes out of Minnesota. It's been in existence for 35 years. And what it does is it brings together adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities through like an 8-week course with parents of children, young children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And you say, why that? Because parents of young children need to see a future. And they need to learn from adults who say, this is my life and this is what is possible, right? They come together and they learn how to navigate these systems that people, like, how do you change something if you don't know how to navigate it? They learn how to navigate it. They make social connections. They make political connections. And it is about doing this long-term change work. And what this means is that an organization I'm affiliated with at the States trying to end the payment of the sub-minimum wage for people with intellectual disabilities in my state is that when you testify at the legislature and when you're going office to office to office, it's not me. It's people like me supporting people with intellectual disabilities to sit there and to tell their story and face to face with legislators, right? Challenging them, right? And so it's change it, but they have the tools and the understanding how to navigate that with support, right? Power change through Voices at the Table Australia, and social norm change And if you get a chance to look at Down Syndrome International's Assume That I Can, So That I Will, look it up. Creating campaigns with messaging and messages that are right, people they themselves, empowerment kinds of messages. That's part of this societal level work that we're going to be profiling in this book that we need to be doing. That is violence prevention.
And as I said, it's about what we can all do. Like it's too often that we hear, "Oh, I'm not funded to do that." So think about this. Everyone who's working, well, almost anywhere can think about this at a policy level, etc. Voices at the Table, check it out. It's an Australian model of working people with intellectual disabilities and governance, basically, of their own services and of being on government boards, etc. I'm going to end up with this community level. What I want to say about the community level is that what sort of we talked about was, look, Me Too has really been, #MeToo has been really important in changing public perception and community-driven work around preventing violence, but it did not include women. It particularly didn't include women and girls with intellectual disabilities, and there's some critique of that. There's a lot of good community level approaches in prevention, like bystander engagement, no wrong door, coordinated community responses, and community education campaigns. But have they included people with disabilities? Are they in partnership? Are they cross disability? Are they cross solidarity? Are they in collaboration and coalition with people with intellectual disability? Because when they are, we get change at the community level. And Nancy and I are finding and profiling a number of programs and approaches. And I really encourage everyone to look at Illinois Imagines. It actually works very well with the work that Donald Beasley are doing around strengthening response services. The work of the ARC in Minnesota that Nancy knows a lot more about. And I've talked to you about what's happening in Gippsland with sexual lives and respectful relationships. We had a 2-hour conversation with them the other day, and I was in awe of the work that they're doing. What they've done is they've said, everyone matters all the time. Yes, we've always tried to work with people with intellectual disabilities, but we've kept it pretty small. And then we've run this sexual lives and respectful relationships. We're going to bring these things together. And what we're going to do is create in our communities through an intersectional context, because they happen to be a community in Gippsland, it's a big part of Victoria, where 48% of the people who come to their services identify as having a disability. So that's 48% of people in Gippsland who come to Centres Against Sexual Assault say they have identify as having a disability. So they said, we have to do more about this. And what they're doing through the sort of what I've got SLNRR++, because it's the new version, it's the new part of it, is they're saying we need to take this much further, and we have to do a whole lot more work in ensuring that it sits alongside everything else we do. So that collaborative cross-solidarity work. So it's a bit of a watch this space, but I just wanted to share that. And obviously the VIP work that I talked about in Scandinavia, which is now moving and changing as I probably speak, to be much more aligned in the community. So VIP in Norway, it's run by an organisation called the Equality Centre in collaboration with the National Sexual Assault Service. It's not run by disability again. It's not, it's actually very much within the general work of that organisation, which is based on community level change. So it's about those collaborations and those cross-solidarity where community level work really can work. And I think everybody probably in this room and everybody on the Zoom and everybody who works in disability, who works in social sort of science research, in policy, in politics, etc., can do this work. And we're hoping that by profiling it and aligning it with the social ecological model, we can I think build people's confidence in doing that and make those connections, hopefully across the world. There's a lot more that's going to be there, but we just wanted to sort of highlight those 2 parts with you today, because we think they're probably something most, I guess, relatable within a critical disability studies kind of framing of how we can work. So thank you.
Thank you again, Patsy and Nancy. I'm in the unenviable position of just getting a wrap-up call from okay, sorry, I misinterpreted, Ruth. We are at the University of Otago. It's final stages of exams, so we're a little, being respectful about the use of the room. So we've got a couple of minutes. Okay, does anyone, are there any questions from the room? Or, no? Yes, it's okay, nothing there? Yeah, that's great. So we are right on time, and so I will take the opportunity once again to thank our speakers. Thank you for coming from far away, digging into your very important time. Sorry, we were just having some technicals. Digging into your important time and sharing your scholarship and your experience with us. Thank you for that. Thank you for everyone for being here in person again and online. And we have a week off next week. And the following Friday, we have another international guest, Professor Sally Robinson from Flinders University. And that will be another great session. And then our final seminar for the series is a session with some amazing postgrad researchers who will be presenting various stages of their research. So I really hope that you will join us for that. I'd just like to close with karakia before and then, but with great wishes for everyone, as I say, in line and in person for the rest of the day. So we'll just close. Unahia, unahia, unahia ki te urutapu nui, kia wātia ai, kia mama ai te nāko te tinana, me te wairua o te tangata. Goia rā I rogo. Whakairia aki ki runga, kia tina, huie, tai ki e. Thank you, everyone.